Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Agent Training. Today we're talking about controlling your emotions. I just wanted to remind you that next week on Monday, so first thing of the week, we are meeting in person at the 16th Street office. So I really hope you can make it to that. Crystal is going to be teaching us on the DISC personality profiles. She has done it before. It's a really, really amazing time. So please come to that in person. And then also in person tomorrow is BottleWorks grand opening from 2 to 5. I just went to Trader Joe's last night and stocked up on a ton of alcohol for you guys. So you better come because it was embarrassing to walk out with that much alcohol. So you owe me. Okay, that's all I have. I'm going to turn it over to Mark and let him steal the show.
Thanks, Rosie. Morning, everybody. I love the fact that those of you knew what the topic was today was controlling emotions, and you decided to come and engage on that topic because it may not be that normal of a real estate topic. And if you're anything like me, it's perhaps not your favorite topic of conversation. But I think it's super important in our line of work. And so we're going to talk about why it's important. And then we're going to talk about some strategies that I think work fairly well. I do want to lead with a bit of a disclaimer, which is I don't think this is a topic that you can master. And teaching on controlling emotions might unintentionally imply that I think I'm really good at controlling emotions. And I'll just be honest and say that if my wife learned that I was teaching a class on controlling emotions, she would probably say like, "Oh, that's really cute that you're teaching that topic." I think it's something you're always working on. So you don't arrive here, you're always working on being able to discern your emotions and control them. But in our line of work, it is a matter of your job performance. I think the better you get at this, the better you are at your job. So I think that's what makes it an important topic. I'm going to share a little presentation here. Oops. There we go. Y'all see that? Good. Hang on. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about why this matters. We're going to then look at some examples. And I want you guys to engage in that section where we can talk about some examples of not controlling emotions. What does that look like when we've done it, when we've seen others do that? Then we're going to look at 5 different strategies to control emotions and finish by talking about how this connects to our job and why it's important in that it helps us serve our clients' needs. So first, why does this matter? I think I have 2 quotes here that I think kind of help me frame this in terms of what emotions can do to the negative in our industry. This quote from Carl Sagan, it's a little bit random to quote him in a real estate seminar, but I think this is a really interesting thought that when, as human beings, we have strong emotions, we're liable to fool ourselves. So it's not necessary, right? Strong emotions don't necessarily fool us, but when we're experiencing the strongest emotions, we're liable to make ourselves believe something that isn't true. And when we do that as a real estate professional, we're probably exposing ourselves and our clients to something that we don't have to some negative outcome that we don't necessarily have to expose them to. Second quote is that every time we allow someone to move us with anger, we teach them to be angry. Guys, we could spend an hour talking about that quote by itself in a lot of different contexts, but let's be honest for a second. We're in an industry where people get fired up, and it's actually kind of broadly accepted, right? That people get fired up. It's just kind of one of the markers of our industry. But when we allow that to influence our behavior, so that's what I take when it says to move us, when we allow someone else's strong emotive response to influence our behavior, we're actually teaching them that the anger and the aggression is going to work. And I think it's a lack of control of our emotions that typically will have us influenced by someone else's emotions. Okay, so examples of not controlling emotions. I'm gonna stop my screen share here for a minute and want you guys to participate here. I want to hear from you. If you really want to do an example that's not connected to our industry, I suppose that's fine. But I do mean specific to within relationship to a real estate client or in a transaction with another realtor. Give me some examples of what you have seen. Could be yourself, could be the other side of a transaction, where agents weren't controlling their emotions. What does that look like? And you don't have to tell me if it was you or the other person, but I'm totally going to know it was you.
I have a good one.
Go, Leslie. Thank you.
I did a transaction earlier this year with a veteran agent, and she was selling her daughter's house, and it was a really, really bad idea. She just got very fired up over lots of small things. And she was even reacting to things and like making them seem like the appraisal came in low, but my clients agreed to pay over appraisal. And she just threw a big fit about it and made them like submit an extra deposit of earnest money, which they were willing to do because this was like their fourth offer and they finally got it accepted. But she just wasn't thinking clearly. Like, we weren't amending the purchase price or anything. She just got very fired up. She had some very strong words with the lender, called him some names. So it got real spicy. So
spicy is such a great word to use in that context. Yeah, that's a really good example, Leslie. Thank you. Somebody else give me one.
It's Natanya. I have one. I'm sorry, you still can't see me on audio. I still am not presentable. I mean, on video. We wanted to put an offer in, and we were about to. And the agent called me early in the morning to talk about some terms that would make it really great. And I talked to my clients, and then she said, okay, if you put that offer in, I think you're going to get it. And so I said, great, I'm going to talk to my clients. And then she kept texting me like every other second. Nothing's changed. Where's the offer? Emojis. What's going on? And calling my phone and going, I don't understand. Where's the offer? And she just kept it was my second offer I wrote. And I just stopped responding to her.
Yeah. What do you think? What was the emotion going on for her, Natanya? That's a really interesting example. What was going on for her, and what do you think it meant?
I think that she was very anxious, and she probably overpromised something to her clients and was expecting to have it at a drop of a hat for her. And she was trying to control me. And I wasn't going for it. And so then that made her angry and freaked out.
I also think it's interesting in that situation where that person's eagerness and maybe their lack of awareness of their eagerness a lot of times tells you, oh, right, there's an offer less attractive than this one that they will take.
Yeah, she put her cards on the table pretty clearly.
Yeah, this agent is jumping at this offer. And therefore there's probably something that's less, attractive to the seller than this offer that the seller will take. That's a really good example. Give me one more. Anybody willing to give me an example of when they didn't control their emotions very well in a transaction?
Yes.
Is that Andrew?
Let's talk about it. Yeah. And we'll see if it was for good reason or not. But I was in the middle of an inspection negotiation, and we're working through it on a weekend. The agent's a pretty experienced managing broker, so that might have had something to do with the way I reacted to him, knowing that he had, he should have known better. We all should know better. But this guy sold another home to his clients while negotiating an inspection response on the home they were under contract with on us. I'm representing the seller, obviously. So Sunday came to, after negotiating Friday, Saturday through things, received a mutual release rather than their inspection response. So I think I think a Ford Pinto was brought up and somebody driving their kid to prom in a Ford Pinto. And I thought that was just a terrible analogy. And I really kind of just blatantly told him he probably shouldn't be managing an office and that he might want to look into certain standards of practice. And I wasn't very nice about it. So
how did that deal finish out?
No, we released them. You know how it finished out, actually, some wonderful people that Mark, and your team actually helped sell that. So I think it was just meant to be that they were the wrong buyers, and that's often the case. And the right people got the house, and his buyers bought something else in Pickwick Farms, and which is an adjacent neighborhood to the neighborhood we were in Cedar Point. And it was a doozy. I mean, these guys were really blatantly negotiating this inspection response while negotiating the purchase of another home. So the agent was doing that to deceive us, and or perhaps they weren't sure if they were getting the house on Pickwick, maybe. But either way, it was a shit show.
Sounds about right. Something that Andrew said there right at the start of when he was sharing that, I think is interesting. Andrew, I don't want to misquote you, but I believe what you said was essentially, we'll see if it was warranted. Like, was it justified? And you guys, I'm still growing in my emotional intelligence 100%. This is an area of education for me. I actually tend to believe that emotions are by definition warranted. Human beings respond with emotions because that's what we are. I think the key question as a realtor is not to ask, is this emotion warranted? I think the best advice I've received is immediately acknowledge that if you're experiencing the emotion, it's valid. Then enact a strategy of what to do with that emotion. So you'll note here where in a moment I'm going to transition to start talking about like some strategies that I've come across that I think work well, that I think are really good for realtors in order to control emotions. But none of these would imply that it is the having of the emotion that is the problem, because that is out of your control. You are an emotional being. You have them. People joke. I mean, I'm not someone that tends to display my emotions very often. That has nothing to do with whether I have them, right? I do. I just display them very differently. Some might say I tend to suppress the emotions. We could get into that, but that's another topic for another day. It doesn't change the fact that as human beings, we have them. They're always warranted. The strategy for a realtor is to recognize them and learn how to deal with them. And I think control is a good way to think about it, right? Not to ignore, not to suppress, not to try to avoid them or pretend like they don't exist. None of those will help you in the long run, but to acknowledge them and control them. So I'm going to pop back into sharing my screen and chat a little bit about some strategies for controlling emotions. And again, I just want to say these are things that you don't arrive at expert level or certainly not perfection in doing these things. But I think the more that you are able to do them, the more that you will see the upside. of controlling the emotions. So number one, step away. One of my teammates and I were joking about this recently. For her, sometimes it is actually literally physically stepping away from like whatever device it is she's using to communicate. She has found that it is particularly helpful in a moment where there's emotions on both sides in a difficult part of a transaction. She will actually physically step away from the device, right? So you don't necessarily physically have to do it, but I think you have to ask sometimes, do I need to respond right now at this second? Most of the time in transactions or in a conversation with clients, you don't. It is very rare that the situation requires an immediate response. Now, there might be a deadline, but the deadline typically isn't in the next 60 seconds, right? And I think it is true of human beings that we essentially never make our response worse by stepping away for a moment, especially not in our business. I think this is a safe statement that your response can only get better or more effective if you step away. And sometimes you don't even have to do like hard work of identification or processing, just purely the exercise of giving it time allows the emotions to settle. So that's a little bit different than identifying them and thinking about where they're coming from. That's some of the other strategies. But I think the most simple strategy is to acknowledge I don't have to respond right now. And if I give it 10 minutes or 24 hours, depending on the circumstance, I am more likely to be able to get to the meat of what I need to communicate and let the emotions kind of filter out just from giving it time. And that will likely improve the response that you send, whether it's text message, email, you get a voicemail, you need to make a phone call. We're so rarely actually in person in the most tense parts of a transaction. It's always going to be a form of communication where you have that control. So step away, give it time, because you don't have to respond right now. Second example, talk it out with another person. I think this can be really healthy. It could be a teammate, a coworker, a brokerage staff person, Crystal, myself or Rex, maybe a significant other or a sibling, somebody that's close to you. I know many of you, I was actually just meeting 2 days ago with a realtor who was talking about how their significant other was probably very sick of them processing their emotions from a transaction. So that can certainly happen. But I think people in the industry, find your kind of go-to people here at Platt that you could just say, do you have 10 minutes? Can I just talk this through with you? And that person doesn't have to have the silver bullet magic answer. But what happens? So unmute yourself if you want to chime in here. What happens when you talk it out with someone else who understands the industry? What are they likely to do for you?
Diffuse.
Yeah. Natanya, tell me, why is that likely to happen? What do they have in that moment that you don't?
They don't have the feeling behind the emotion that I do.
Yeah. And a good listener probably isn't going to say, oh, Natanya, just calm down. That's usually terrible advice. But they might be able to ask good questions. They might be able to just identify with you and say like, oh, like that's terrible that the other side is communicating that way. Hearing that from another person can validate your emotion and say, okay, I'm not crazy. This emotion that I'm feeling is normal. And now I've started to, as I think, Natanya, you used the word diffuse. I was thinking de-escalate. I have started to let those emotions settle, partially because I've given it time, but partially because I'm verbalizing them with someone who isn't involved in the transaction. When an agent on another side of a deal, when they're frustrating you, or maybe it's the client on the other side of the deal, when the other side of a transaction is frustrating you and you feel that emotional response start to come up, who is the wrong person for you to talk that out with? Realtors do this all the time, by the way.
Your client.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Anybody want to tell me why is your client the wrong person to vent, to talk it out with as you're feeling those emotions? What are you doing if you talk it out with your client and vent to them?
I think you're potentially getting them fired up over something they shouldn't be fired up about, and probably not giving yourself the time to process it before you come back to them with a solution.
Mm. Yeah, you're putting weight on them. They've got plenty of weight, right? I'm going to come back to this, but I think it is oftentimes our job to essentially like consume as many of the emotions in the transaction as we can. And when we talk it out or vent to our client, like if you're frustrated with the other side of a transaction and the first person you talk to is your client, you are more than likely going to increase the amount of emotions that they feel, therefore increasing their burden of trying to control their emotions. Look, it happens, short deadlines, it's the natural course. You talk to the other side of a transaction. Now I need to talk to my client. If at all possible, when you're feeling the strong emotion, talk to someone else for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It will be invaluable in you being able to settle them, control your own emotions, and therefore bring what is truly critical to your client. And Kristen, I love what you said there. You probably don't have a solution yet. If you're venting to your client, whatever it is that's frustrating you, you don't have a solution yet. And in an ideal world, you're not talking to your client until you have some potential solutions. So talk it out with another person, disclaimer, who is not your client. The third one, and you can tell these, they're getting deeper and more philosophical as we go through them. The first one is very pragmatic and even physical, but they get more kind of ethereal as we go. The third one is ask yourself a question. What is it that I fear right now? And is my fear helping me? And I again, this is getting pretty deep, but generally speaking, when we experience strong emotions, particularly if we're experiencing strong negative emotions, anxiety, anger, sadness, oftentimes there's something there that we're afraid of. What is it that I fear right now? When the other side of a transaction does something, maybe my client does something that stirs up that emotion, there's probably down below that emotion some outcome that you're afraid of. And I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily an irrational fear. There's rational fears and there's irrational fears. I don't think you really have to evaluate really deeply whether it's irrational or rational to ask, what is it that I fear right now? And then is that fear helping me in this moment? And I think sometimes naming the fear illustrates like, oh, right. I am afraid my client's going to be dissatisfied with me. I am afraid this transaction's going to fall apart. I am afraid the other agent will make me look stupid. Right? There's these fears that can feel very heavy and can influence us a lot. I am afraid that I will be deemed a failure. But naming that and trying to get at, again, just in a couple minutes, what is it that I'm afraid right now that is causing me to be angry or stressed out or anxious? And then is that fear helping me to make a good decision? And this is a hard practice. This is like, I think a lot of times as agents, this is something we're going to have to do after everything is done. I think 1 and 2 are more likely to be able to help you in the moment. But this more philosophical practice, it's more likely to be something that you could ask after the fact when you realize, oh, I responded emotionally in that phone call, in that text message, in that email. What was the fear behind that response, and did it help me? And spoiler alert, as a motivator in your communication, fear will never help you. It might be very legitimate, rational fear. But if it's a motivator in your communication, it's likely going to make your communication less effective. So kind of naming it and evaluating like, well, how bad is that outcome? How likely is that outcome? And then how do I process that fear to a point where it no longer affects my response? I'm going to get some feedback on these in a moment, so you guys can stay on mute. The fourth one, zoom out to remind yourself of the basics. I find this to be very effective, particularly because in real estate, 99% of the time, essentially every transaction that we're a part of, there's a degree of mutually beneficial exchange from usually 6 or 7 willing parties. So mutually beneficial exchange from willing parties. We talked about this in the class that I have done on negotiations. It's the basic premise of our industry is that there's all these parties that enter into the marketplace because they have something they want to trade to their benefit. That's what mutually beneficial exchange is. So you might be thinking like 6 or 7 parties. Isn't there just 2? Well, there's the buyer and the seller, but there's also usually 2 realtors involved. There's a lender involved. There's an appraiser involved. There's an inspector involved. There's a title company involved. So there's all these parties, and then all of them are entering this exchange with some degree of willingness. Because so for the buyer has money and they want a house. The seller has a house and they want money, right? The buyer has income and credit and they want a mortgage. And the mortgage company has cash, right? And they want to distribute that in the form of a mortgage. And so if you can remind yourself and zoom out, again, oftentimes it's going to come from the other side of the transaction, but to remind yourself that the parties are willingly here and they want to exchange something. I have found that this current market might be an exception to this, but I think historically inspections tend to be a very emotional part of the transaction. That's where temperatures can get high. Certainly in price negotiations you can, but usually it's during your contract period, not during negotiations in the purchase agreement, but negotiations of your contingencies is where emotions are likely to come out the most. This market's obviously a little bit different when you're competing, to get a house purchased. But during inspections, I think this is a good example of where it's helpful to remember the seller wants to sell the house and the buyer wants to buy the house. Emotions from them or from agents can hide that or mask that, right? But it doesn't change the basic reality that there's still this possible mutually beneficial exchange where people don't always act like an exchange is mutually beneficial, right? This is the situation where, the buyer agrees to buy the house and they're talking about how they think the seller has taken advantage of them and it's not an equal sided transaction, but yet the buyer has agreed to it. And there's all this emotion surrounding, like, I feel like I kind of got, one got taken over on me or something like that. Well, I think remembering that at its root, there is still a mutually beneficial exchange happening, just perhaps not the way the client had envisioned, can help you to categorize their emotions, therefore control yours. So zoom out to remind yourself of the basics, that these parties are all involved because they want to trade something to their own benefit, yourself included. Fifth one, remember there is nothing new. Every deal is unique, that's true. But their principles are their principles. And whatever is happening in your transaction or with your client, it's happened before and it will happen again. I think this is why really seasoned agents are more likely to be able to control their emotions. I suppose you could make the argument that really seasoned agents tend to be older and that with age, they have learned to control their emotions. That might be true. I think it's actually more likely that because they're a seasoned agent, they have a bigger set of data. They have a bigger set of experiences where they know they've seen that frustrating thing. They've seen that strong emotion. They've felt that strong emotion many times before. And the vast majority of those times, they know things worked out fine, right? They can see to the other side a little bit faster because they remember all this has happened before and it's going to happen again. As a newer agent, it requires more intentionality to remember that whatever is happening is probably not all that unique. It doesn't mean it's not important. Every transaction is very important. It doesn't mean that the emotions aren't real or valid, but I think it helps you correctly categorize that emotion that you're feeling to remember, oh yeah, this has happened before and it turned out fine, and this won't be the last time. I think you're correctly categorizing it if you think of it that way. Last one, take the long view. This is pretty similar to number 5, but I think the distinction I'm going for here in take the long view is, here, let me give you an example of this. I think this helps to explain it, particularly with your client, right? I think the examples that each of you gave, the 3 examples that we heard at the start of the call, they were all about the strong emotions between the 2 sides of a transaction, right? And that's the most common. That's where we're normally going to feel those really strong emotions and have to figure out what to do with them. But clearly, we experience emotions in the relationship between us and our client, right? And oftentimes our clients will do things that drive us crazy, right? Sometimes we can kind of write off or like categorize the agent on the other side as like a bad actor in some way. And we don't like have to like live in relationship with them. So it's just easier to categorize it. When our clients are doing things that piss us off, it's harder, I find, it's harder to deal with those because you're more likely in relationship with that person. This is where I think taking the long view can be helpful. And this is, it's a business approach. It's very pragmatic. But with a client, sometimes taking the long view is saying, okay, what you're doing right now frustrates me. But if I respond out of that frustration, which in a lot of relationships is likely a healthy thing to do, right? But with your client, if you respond out of frustration, you're probably going to allow negative impact to that relationship that I think you're ignoring the fact that it's a professional relationship where you're a service provider, right? you're not necessarily getting compensated to be a really close friend that will always kind of quote unquote like say it, the way that it needs to be said, or confront them, right? Yes, their interests are your job, and there's going to be times where you have to say hard things to your client. But generally speaking, if you're speaking out of frustration to your client, you're probably kind of cutting the legs out from a long-standing relationship that could exist. And this doesn't mean you let a client walk over you. But I do think there's some examples. Again, a teammate of mine had one of these last week where we chatted through it. And it's always easier when you're kind of on the outside of it to be able to say, hey, what they did was absolutely unfair. That was unfair to you. Now, let's take the 10-year view. What response to your client benefits you and the relationship with that client the most over the 10-year run? And that, I think, is a way to control emotions, because you're feeling, again, this valid emotion of this person did something that was unfair towards me as their professional. But yet I have to think really hard about how I'm going to respond to that. And this, again, it doesn't, like, look, there are plenty of things that a client can do or say that I would say, oh gosh, you should just not be in a relationship with that person. You don't want to service their business. It's not worth it. Let it go. Fire them. Plenty of that. I'm talking about more kind of unintended or small little moments of things that the client does. Perhaps waste your time is a big one, right? Like when a client ends up wasting your time on something that happens every day. How do you respond to that? And the emotion that you feel, I think a lot of times taking the long 10-year view of the relationship with that client will correctly categorize and help you know, like, when should I bring this up? And in what way? What is it that I'm going to say? Okay, good. I've left at least 15 minutes. What I would love to do before we conclude in talking about serving your client's interest, if y'all would either unmute yourself or jump into the chat. I'd love to kind of go through some specific deal examples and say, what does it look like to do these strategies? And so I'll just verbally here remind you of the number one. So be thinking, as I reread these, be thinking about moments in hypothetical or real transactions where you could say, okay, here's what that would look like. Here's how I've been able to do that. Or maybe here's when I know I should have done that. I've got some examples ready, but I would love to hear from you. So number one, step away. Don't respond immediately, because most of the time you don't have to. Number two, talk it out with another person who's not your client. Number three, ask yourself the fear question. What is it that I fear right now? And is that fear helping me? Number four, zoom out to remind yourself of the basics, that there is a mutually beneficial exchange happening. Number five, remember that nothing is new. Whatever it is that's happening in this deal, it's happened before, it's going to happen again. And then number six, take the long view. Think about the 10-year value, and when 10 years from today, looking back, how do you wish you would have responded to the benefit of that relationship? So I've shared a few examples, but I'd love to hear from you guys. What comes to mind in any of those six? So tell me which of the six is kind of sticking out to you, and give me an example of how you've seen it or felt it. Kelly, were you
I've got one.
Yes, go Kelly.
I had clients 2.5 years ago so this is about taking the long view, looked at this house. We spent hours in it. I spent hours talking to them about it. We had the deal nearly put together. And they pretty much got everything they wanted for this house. And if I had thought about it, I probably would have realized it wasn't the right house for them. But when at the very last minute, they decided that they didn't want to move forward, I expressed my frustration in that. But, I feel like we could have arrived at this point before we spent so many hours on it. They have done 3 transactions since then, and none of them with me, because I did not graciously let them exit. And the real funny part of that is that's the house I just moved into. It was not the right house for them. And had they bought it, I don't think I'd be moved into it right now. So just kind of an interesting one where I definitely lost control of my emotions and ruined what could have been a really great relationship.
That is a crazy small world example. Indianapolis really is this tiny little town that you now live in that house.
Which is why I knew the house so
that's
well when it came on the market.
Yeah, it's such a good example though, because that's like Kelly's response in terms of human relationship was likely totally warranted, right? Like they probably didn't make the decision like in a responsible or rational order, right? They could have done things differently. Kelly probably, everything that Kelly said to them in that moment, I bet was true, right? Kelly, like you didn't actually misspeak. You were talking about something that was real and true, and you were defending yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then 10 years later, or probably not 10 years, but I think that is a very good example of with a client. That is, by the way, Kelly's example is fairly similar to something I was kind of working through with a teammate last week. I think that happens pretty often.
I think sometimes when it's hardest is when it's right in the middle of busyness with other things and you have to prioritize between different clients. And so in that case, the hours I spent on them, I probably could have gotten something else put together. And I think that's part of what made it so hard, but it also would have been one of my highest priced sales at that point in time. And maybe it was partly because I was a little bit in love with the house too. I don't know, but it was a weird situation. Yeah. And they would have been a great referral source because they lived in the neighborhood as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly. That is coincidental and really relevant. Thanks. Who else has got one of these 6 that comes to mind?
I do. Number 3 with, I think it's talking it out. Poor Michelle gets me every time I walk in the office. She goes, "Hello, Natanya." And she goes, "Oh," and she stands up and puts her mask on and just listens. And always, she's great at it. I so appreciate her. I did it to her yesterday. I got an inspection response and I said, "I'm so frustrated by this inspection response." And she goes, "Tell me about it." And it was wonderful. So thank you, Michelle.
That is fantastic. Both that it was a frustrating inspection response, which might be the thing all of us could identify with. And you're right, Michelle is a good person. We should like literally put this on Michelle's job description.
Mm-hmm.
One of Michelle's duties.
Yes.
Yeah, no, she's great at it. Okay, so that is take the long view and talk it out with another person. Anybody have one of the others? Step away, ask yourself what I fear right now.
I have maybe an example of step away. I had clients who we counter offered and they ended up not getting the house that they wanted. And we were texting and I texted them and said they took another offer. And it was like, emojis, that you would expect from them. And, and I said, I forget what I said, just something very kind of calming, like, yeah, sorry to hear that, but let's see what the next house is for you or whatever. And then they kept on. And I actually started to type in and like kind of be in that moment with them. And I decided, nope, I need to step out, let them process it instead of fueling like their disappointment and making them, revel in it more. And I just like didn't respond anymore. And then, probably an hour later or so, then they were like, okay, what's our next step? And I think that probably was a good time for me to not invoke myself.
Jamie, that's such a good example, and it works out very cleanly. Your example proves a point there, which is convenient. Thank you. I did not put Jamie up to this. In 1 hour's time, right? It took 1 hour. That like you sometimes in a text thread, you can like see this play out. Oh, here at this point in the text thread, they are processing the emotions of sadness of losing that house. 1 hour later. Now, a lot of times it's not 1 hour, but that quickly, they got to the point where they had transitioned to kind of, practically looking forward. I think that's a really good example of with your client, even sometimes waiting in a situation where there is actually probably not urgency, waiting to respond back. That actually, Jamie, that example, stepping away actually let someone else process their emotions in addition to maybe you. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody want to dive in on the what is it I fear right now? I know this is maybe the hardest one. Asking yourself the emotions that I'm feeling, what fear is at the basis?
I have something that I think is you can categorize.
Go for it, Leslie. Yeah.
I had a listing, and the sellers are good friends. I've known them for like 11 years. So that's like the aha moment I had later. But their house is older. They made updates to it, but as far as maintenance, I actually had just come off of a transaction where the seller thought everything was great and we had to replace the furnace. We had a gas leak. Like I was super jaded from inspections. So I went into this listing saying, okay, like your house is older, like, just kind of trying to prepare them for what inspections could potentially look like, because I felt like I didn't do a very good job of that on that condo. And they're like, oh no, it's fine. Everything's great. Like they were very confident. And I just said, oh, like, all right. And then we got our inspection report back and it was there's knob and tube that their inspector missed in 2012. Things, the roof needs replaced. Like it's just, I got so worked up, not in front of them. Big shout out to Andrew, because I literally like just call him and process. I was getting like anxious and worked up about it. And I've never gotten that way about it before, about like, what am I so afraid of? Why am I so anxious? And like, it was like treating it like my house and like I was responsible for these items because number one, they were close friends. And then number two, I felt they didn't hear me when I said we could potentially have some bigger inspection items. And I like felt really responsible for that. So I think just even acknowledging that really helped me because like we got through it. It's fine. But it was like, yeah, it was really hard because I had a lot of fear and anxiety about that inspection.
That's really good. Something that Leslie said there sticks out to me. Leslie, you said, I was feeling like almost as if it was my house. They're close friends of mine. They're buying it as if like the knob and tube wiring was like my fault. And right, like they're gonna like view this as my responsibility and it's gonna be dissatisfying and they're friends of mine. I think that's a good example of when you're asking that question of what is it that I'm afraid of, it can help you to identify some of those things where, like in that case, there's some rational fears there. You want them to have a good outcome. There's some bad outcomes that are possible. That's a rational fear. But there's also some irrational ones in there that you can identify. And then to say, like, okay, rational or irrational, is that fear helping me to help them? Generally speaking, it's not. It's something that you need to work through, right? Usually internally, but Leslie, you also hit on strategy number 2 there when you said you call Andrew, right? Just talk it out with him. He probably doesn't have this great answer, but it just helps you to categorize those things correctly. Great, thank you.
He does usually have great answers, but and it's true, like the fear from that, like I felt immobilized for like a day. Like I know what I need to do, but I can't do it. And it was really hard for me to even the process of like helping them, like leading them through this inspection period. So like I had to acknowledge that before I could even feel like I wasn't shackled anymore by that nationality. Like BenTube has been there, like they've lived in this house since 2012 and they didn't know it was there. Like it's, you know, I just had to honestly recognize like kind of the ridiculousness of it to a point. So
right. Thank you, Leslie. So my goal is to be done at 10. So I'm going to wrap us up here with one final thought about this really comes back to why controlling emotions matters. And I think the best way to think about this is just to get to the basics of what our job is as realtors. And I think at its root, our job as realtors, it's not selling houses, right? At its root, our job is to service the needs of a client, right? We take on a human being as a client who has a particular goal, to sell or buy a house, and it is our job to act in their interests. We're providing them information. We're talking with them about strategy. We're executing for them. We're doing busy work for them. We're saving them time. We are increasing the likelihood that they have a positive outcome. That's our job as a realtor. They have needs. We're servicing those needs. And our responsibility is to our client's interest. And at a really basic level, I think that means we have to acknowledge that the business isn't about us, right? The business is not about us. It's about our client. A really good realtor knows that. And that is why controlling our emotions matters. I actually think if buyers and sellers were able to really truly control their emotions in the process, they're less likely to need a realtor. This is one of the things that we actually add value into the process. We're professionals. We've seen it before. It's not our personal house. Leslie mentioned working with a realtor who was selling her daughter's house and that was a struggle. Those degrees of separations in those experiences help us to control emotions. And a lot of times we need to shield our client from the emotions of the other side, right? We're not doing any good bringing the emotions of the other side to our client. We're certainly not doing any good bringing our emotions to weigh on our client. And that controlling those things is a part of helping our client achieve their goal according to their interests. And if that's the basis of our job, then learning to control your emotions, it isn't just about your outcome. It's helping you to be good at your job of improving your client's outcome, shielding them from certain negative things, helping them get through a transaction. Yes, it's probably going to make the transaction a more pleasant experience for them, which matters. But I think in real, tangible ways, controlling your emotions will lead to better outcomes for your client, and that's your job. And so while I think this is like healthy, emotional maturity for an adult to be able to control their own emotions, our line of work adds in that sometimes it's actually vital to us being good at our job, because it will improve our clients' outcomes in a lot of transactions. Final thought, if you don't take anything away, I would say one thing that you could do is it's a combination of 1 and 2. So you don't have to get into all the philosophical, like remembering the basics, asking the fear question, taking the long view. I mean, those are bigger picture things. If you as a realtor did nothing but wait to respond and talk with someone else first, if you just always do that, you're going to end up doing 3, 4, 5, and 6. If you force yourself to give it a minute and have a conversation with someone who's not involved, those 2 things probably take care of the rest of them. And they're simple, but oftentimes not easy. The easiest thing to do is fire the text back right away. That will always be the easiest thing to do. And generally speaking, not the best thing to do. So step away, talk it out with another person. If you do that, you'll probably do pretty well on the other strategies. Y'all, thanks for joining this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Rosie, who might do a reminder of a couple other things coming up. Second, shout out for tomorrow afternoon at the BottleWorks office. Hope to see you there.
I really don't have anything else. That was lovely. Thanks, Mark. Everyone, hopefully we will see you tomorrow at the grand opening. Remember that we don't have training on Fridays. So don't show up here on Zoom in the morning, show up in person at the BottleWorks office at 2, in between 2 and 5. Okay, bye everyone.